NATO is a step closer to getting two nations larger today, with Finland and Sweden signing official papers aimed at making them the 31st and 32nd members of the organization.
We share the same values and we face the same challenges in the Baltic Sea and beyond. Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine has shattered peace in Europe. So it is important we all stand together at this dangerous moment in our history.
Of note, Finland shares an 840-mile land border. Sweden shares a maritime border with Russia, which is well into month 5 of its invasion of Ukraine. At this point, Russia is aiming its main offensive at the eastern Donbas region after declaring victory in Luhansk province over the weekend. And while Biden has promised to continue supporting Ukraine, as he recently acknowledged, there's still a lot of uncertainty and a lot of Americans who are far more worried about their wallet than what happens in Europe.
We are going to support Ukraine as long as it takes. Inflation is higher in almost every other country. Prices at the pump are higher in almost every other country. We're better positioned to deal with this than anyone, but we have a way to go. I don't know how it's going to end, but it will not end with a Russian defeat of Ukraine in Ukraine.
I'm joined by Carol Saivetz, Senior Advisor for MIT's Security Studies Program and a Research Associate at Harvard's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies and the Harvard Ukrainian Institute, and Tom Nichols, an international affairs expert, a regular contributor to The Atlantic, and author of its Peacefield newsletter. Carol and Tom, good to see you again.
Nice to see you.
So, Carol, starting with you, following up on Russian successes in eastern Ukraine, as a layperson, I feel like I'm watching the slow motion slaughter of the Ukrainian fighters. Am I overreacting?
I don't think you're overreacting, Jim, but I think that we need to put it into some kind of perspective. I think that the victory in Luhansk is a symbolic victory, and I think that the fight for Donetsk is going to be long and drawn out still. The Ukrainians still hold Kramatorsk and Slovyansk, and these are two major holdouts on the Ukrainian side. The problem, I think, and what you're reacting to and what we're all reacting to viscerally is that we see the pictures of just these massive bombardments, artillery shells, indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas, and the Russians have proven that they can hit just about any place in Ukraine arbitrarily, just to sort of prove that they can do it without any military value.
And Tom, what the Ukrainian leaders are saying is if they had more modern weaponry, they could counter much of that offensive. Do they have a point?
Sure. And they're getting a lot of weaponry and they are countering a lot of this offensive. Remember, there's kind of a rough rule of thumb in military affairs that you need something like 3-to-1 to conduct an offensive against somebody who's dug in and defending. And the Ukrainians are losing a lot of people. They're the smaller force here, but the Russians are basically sending men and materials into a meat grinder. They're just chewing up their own forces and losing a lot of their own equipment because they don't care, because they have plenty of it to waste. And so the losses, to echo Carol's point, part of what we're reacting to is that the Ukrainian losses are dearer to the Ukrainians because they are smaller and because they care more about their people. But the Russians are just throwing people into this because they can, and that's going to make this drag on for quite a long time. But with more advanced weapons, it means that the Russians are basically having to up the ante and use numbers to overcome that weaponry.
Tom, staying with you for a minute, I mentioned Finland and Sweden and the process moving along. How big a deal is that in real terms? I understand it further isolates Russia, but what's the practical consequence of that? Any?
Oh, it's huge.
How so?
These are two of the most militarily capable states in Northern Europe. And the idea, I think, when Carol and I first started studying what we would have called Soviet affairs, you would never have thought that the balance of power in Europe would be so disrupted by what the Russians are doing, that Finland and Sweden would become the 31st and 32nd members of NATO. I mean, this really, from here and for the foreseeable future, puts and keeps Russia in the status of an inferior conventional power, which means that all they can do is brutalize the people on their own borders and threaten nuclear retaliation if anybody tries to get in their way to do that. But NATO, I mean, NATO's never been this powerful in its history.
Can I jump in for a sec? I mean, I think we have to remember that Finland and Sweden are already sort of NATO compatible military forces. They've been cooperating with NATO for years, so there's not a long process to get them up to speed to join NATO ranks. I mean, they're there.
You know, so that's the good news, according to you both. The bad news, for at least from my perspective, I don't know if you saw this poll. Admittedly, it's a month plus old, but I would argue the numbers would be more troubling, not less troubling. This is a poll from YouGov and Data Praxis. 8,100 adults in 10 European countries. What is most important in the Ukraine-Russian war? Stop the war as soon as possible, 35%. Punish Russia, 22%. 43% have no opinion, neither of these, that sort of thing. That tied with the fact that in the United States here, while still relatively small, I think there were 57 Republicans in the House who voted against the $40 billion from the U.S. in May, and I think there were 11 Senate Republicans. Those numbers seem to be growing too, despite the assurances, Tom, from President Biden the other day, the sort of the old as long as it takes kind of thing. Are the people of those countries and this country bought into the as long as it takes thing?
Well, first, Jim, I'm going to take issue with the wording in that poll. There is something in between stop everything right now or punish Russia. I mean, if you ask me, do I want to stop the fighting as soon as possible? Of course I do, but not at any cost to Ukraine, which is the unspoken next part of that sentence. And you know, that the other option here isn't punishing Russia. It's helping Ukraine to defend itself for as long as it needs to. I think Americans...
That's
but I was going to say, America. Sorry, go ahead, Jim.
Accepting that criticism of the poll, what's your assessment of how strong and solid the support of the people in all these countries, including ours, is of continued relentless support at great financial cost of Ukraine?
Well, and I was going to say, the American public is far more supportive of this than the Republican Party, which is really, you know, a shocking reversal for the party of Reagan from the 80s. Mm-hmm. And so I think that as with most things in foreign policy, the president and the leaders of NATO have a lot of latitude to deal with this, as long as people don't think that dealing with this war in Ukraine is somehow directly injuring them or affecting them in some way. I mean, I think people always prioritize domestic politics over foreign policy, which I think is a mistake. But I actually think that the leaders of NATO have a lot more room on this than it seems.
Well, you know, except Carol, I would say to that at least the leaders are suggesting to their people that this is affecting them. Joe Biden continues to refer to it as Putin's inflation. Leaders of France, Germany, other countries are talking about how energy costs are going up in great part because of what's happening in Ukraine. So is that softening popular support or is it not?
Well, I think Biden is trying to brand what's happening to like gasoline prices in this country as directly a result of
of course he is.
Ukraine.
Of course he is.
I mean, so that's part of the.
But the American people are hearing
they're
hearing from their president. One of the reasons you're paying $5 a gallon is because of this war, whether it happens to be as true as Joe Biden would like us to believe it is or not. No.
Well, I think one of the problems is that Putin is counting on precisely what you're hinting at, that as he cuts off gas supplies, natural gas supplies to Germany, cuts the electricity grid to Finland, et cetera, he's banking on sort of there being a populist kind of uprising saying, we don't want to deal with this isn't our fight. But so far, those numbers that, whether or not you agree with the way the question was asked, those numbers don't say that this vast majority of people are against the war. They're just beginning to question it. And I think that it's up to the leaders to sell the war to their populations at home. And it's probably accelerating the shift away from Russian natural gas and oil.
Can we add one more point about the polling, which is that if Biden said tomorrow, look, we're out of this, we're done, Ukraine can, can fall, we don't care. The Russians wouldn't stop this war. This war would go on. And then the next poll would say, why isn't Joe Biden doing enough to keep gas prices down while, Russia is rolling across Europe? Because that it would still, oil prices would still be high. The war would still go on. I mean, to some extent, these are no-win scenarios for every NATO leader, because no matter what you do, what the public really wants is for there to be peace in Europe and stable energy prices. And Putin's not going to allow that.
Yeah, well, what's rationality got to do with politics? Before you go, I was stunned when you were both here last month and you both answered the question the same when I asked you, how is this war, what has to happen for this war to end? And Tom, I think you were the first one to answer and said, Putin's got to be gone. And I asked you, do you mean that exactly as you say it? And you said yes. Could you elaborate on that just for a second, Tom, and then Carol?
I just don't think Vladimir Putin's ever going to climb down out of this tree he's put himself in. He believed that this war could succeed. He's not taking no for an answer. He is going to punish the Ukrainians for humiliating him and taking as much territory as he can. Even if Zelensky said tomorrow, I want to negotiate, I want to end this war, we would find ourselves going through what we went through in 2014 until today, which is that Putin would say, okay, we'll negotiate. And meanwhile, there would be conflict every day along the line of contact between the Russians and the Ukrainians.
Carol,
until Putin's gone, this is going to go on.
You agree, even if it turns out Zelensky all of a sudden said, take eastern Ukraine, you still subscribe to Tom's thesis?
I think the fear would be that even if there were a ceasefire declared and there was some kind of line of demarcation or ceasefire between, say, Luhansk and Donetsk and the rest of Ukraine, that Putin would prosecute the war by other means. We saw that, as Tom said, between 2014 and today. There were people being killed every night along the line of demarcation. There were snipers and everything else. And I think he would only use the ceasefire to regroup. The irony to me of the whole thing is that everything Putin said that he wanted has backfired. He now has Sweden and Finland in NATO. He has Ukrainian resolve. He has U.S. support. He has sanctions such as he's never seen before, which are definitely hurting the Russian economy. And he expected none of that.
Carol Saivetz, Tom Nichols, as always, thanks for your thoughts. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You.